Frank Morrison's boots crunch through the frozen undergrowth as he approaches the excavation site, where construction foreman Billy Hatch stands smoking beside a yellow bulldozer, his face pale despite the December cold. The machine sits silent, its blade caked with dark earth and something else, fragments of slate and timber that shouldn't exist in this empty stretch of Maine wilderness. Detective Morrison. Billy's voice carries the tremor of a man who's seen too much. I called the state police like you asked, but they said to wait for you. Said you handle the unusual cases. Frank studies the gouged earth where the bulldozer has torn away decades of forest floor, revealing the skeletal remains of stone foundations and charred wooden beams. The smell hits him first, not the expected odor of old decay, but something sharper, almost medicinal, mixed with the lingering scent of smoke despite the building having burned 80 years ago. Tell me exactly what you found, Billy. From the beginning. Billy drops his cigarette and grinds it under his heel. We were clearing for the new section of Route 1A, standard job. But when I hit this spot with the dozer, the ground just gave way. Like it was hollow underneath. That's when we found the basement. Frank follows Billy toward a gaping hole in the earth, roughly 12 feet square, where the bulldozer blade has broken through into what appears to be a stone-lined chamber. Emergency floodlights illuminate the space below, revealing rows of small metal beds, their frames twisted and blackened but still recognizable. Children's beds. Jesus Christ, Frank whispers, though he's not a religious man. How many? 47 beds in that room alone. But detective. Billy's voice drops to barely above a whisper. That's not the strangest part. Look at the walls. Frank leans closer to the edge of the excavation, squinting in the harsh artificial light. The stone walls of the basement are covered in scratches, thousands of them, gouged deep into the granite blocks. Not random scratches, but deliberate markings that form patterns, symbols, and what might be words in a language Frank doesn't recognize. My grandfather used to tell stories about this place, Billy continues, lighting another cigarette with shaking hands. Said the Sacred Heart Orphanage disappeared one night in 1882. 47 children and 6 adults, all gone without a trace. Nobody ever found bodies, never found evidence of where they went. The town just stopped talking about it. Frank pulls out his notebook, though his hands are steadier than his thoughts. What kind of stories? The kind you don't tell children unless you want them to have nightmares. Grandpa said the people who ran that place weren't right. Said they did things to those kids that weren't Christian. And the night it all ended, people in town saw lights in the sky, heard screaming that carried for miles. A gust of wind carries up from the excavated basement, and Frank catches that strange smell again, antiseptic and smoke, but underneath it something else. Something sweet and cloying that makes his stomach turn. He's investigated crime scenes for 15 years, knows the smell of death in all its forms, but this is different. This smells like fear made manifest. Billy, I need you and your crew to stop work on this section. I'm calling this a potential crime scene until we can get archaeologists and maybe some historians out here. Crime scene. Detective, whatever happened here was 80 years ago. Frank stares down into the basement, where the metal bed frames cast twisted shadows in the floodlight. On the far wall, barely visible in the gloom, he can make out what looks like a larger symbol carved deep into the stone, a circle containing intricate geometric patterns that seem to shift and writhe in the dancing light. Maybe so, Billy. But some crimes don't stay buried. As Frank walks back toward his patrol car to radio for backup, he doesn't notice the way the carved symbols on the basement walls seem to pulse with a faint luminescence whenever clouds pass over the winter sun. He doesn't see how the shadows cast by the twisted bed frames form shapes that look almost like small human figures, frozen in positions of supplication or terror. But Billy sees. Billy has been seeing strange things since the moment his bulldozer blade first broke through into that underground chamber. He's been hearing whispers carried on the wind, speaking in the voices of children who have been dead for 8 decades. He watches Frank's retreating figure and wonders if the detective has any idea what he's truly stumbled upon. In his grandfather's stories, the Sacred Heart Orphanage wasn't just a place where unwanted children were housed. It was a place where they were prepared for something else entirely. Something that required their innocence to be systematically destroyed before they could be offered up to entities that existed in the spaces between prayers and screams. Billy takes one last look at the excavation site before heading to his truck. The winter sun is setting early, casting long shadows across the disturbed earth, and for just a moment he could swear he sees small figures moving among the ruined foundations below. Children's silhouettes, perfectly still, as if they've been waiting patiently for someone to finally find them. The smell of smoke grows stronger as darkness falls, though there are no fires burning anywhere in the frozen Maine wilderness. Have you ever discovered something that made you wish you could bury it again and pretend it never existed? What would you do if the ground beneath your feet held secrets that were never meant to be uncovered? The Millbridge Town Hall basement smells of mildew and forgotten bureaucracy, but Town Clerk Margaret Wessel has spent 30 years navigating its labyrinthine filing systems. She leads Frank through narrow aisles lined with metal shelving, their footsteps echoing off the concrete floor as she searches for the records he's requested. 1882 is tricky, Margaret says, pulling a dust-covered ledger from a high shelf. That was the year of the Great Fire at the courthouse. Lost most of our official records from that decade. Frank opens the ledger carefully, its binding cracked with age. The pages are filled with handwritten entries documenting births, deaths, property transfers, and business licenses, but as he scans the months of 1882, he notices something peculiar. There's a gap, 3 weeks in November where no entries appear at all. Margaret, look at this. November 8 through November 28, 1882. Nothing recorded. Margaret adjusts her reading glasses and peers at the ledger. That's strange. Even during the fire, someone would have been keeping records. Town business doesn't just stop. What about church records? Birth certificates for the orphanage children? That's what makes this so odd, Detective. I've been through everything we have from that period, and there's no mention of the Sacred Heart Orphanage anywhere. No incorporation documents, no inspections, no correspondence with the state about licensing. It's as if the place never officially existed. Frank turns to another section of the ledger, scanning property records. But people remember it. Billy Hatch's grandfather told stories about it. Oh, people remember, Margaret says quietly. My own great-aunt used to warn us children never to play in the woods north of town. Said that was where the bad place used to be. But Detective, here's what really bothers me. I've been the town clerk for 3 decades, and I've never seen a single death certificate for any of those 47 children. She leads Frank to another section of the basement, where older records are stored in climate-controlled cabinets. I did some research after you called. Cross-referenced every document we have from 1880 to 1885. Those children didn't die, Detective Morrison. According to our official records, they never existed at all. Frank feels a chill that has nothing to do with the basement's temperature. What about the adults? The staff who ran the place? Margaret opens another ledger, this one bound in cracked leather. That's where it gets interesting. I found references to a Reverend Matthias Crane who purchased property north of town in 1879. Paid cash, which was unusual for that time period. But after 1882, his name just disappears from all records. Like he left town. No, Detective. Like he was erased. His property deed shows the land was sold in 1883, but there's no record of who bought it or where the money went. The buyer is listed as Estate of M. Crane, but there's no death certificate, no probate proceedings, no will. Frank studies the property deed, noting the precise legal description of the land. It matches exactly with the excavation site where Billy's bulldozer broke through into the basement. Margaret, I need you to show me everything you can find about this Reverend Crane. Bank records, correspondence, anything. I already pulled what little exists. Margaret opens a thin folder containing perhaps a dozen documents. He wasn't from Maine originally. Came here from a place called Dunwich, Massachusetts. Claimed to be ordained by something called the Church of Stellar Wisdom. Frank has never heard of either location, but the name Dunwich strikes him as familiar in a way he can't quite place. Any idea what happened to the other staff members? There were 5 others listed in the property records as residing at the orphanage. Sister Mary Catherine, Brother Thomas Whitmore, Dr. Elias Blackwood, and 2 others whose names are barely legible. But detective, here's what really disturbs me, I found their employment history. She hands Frank a faded carbon copy of what appears to be a reference letter. Before coming to Maine, these people worked together at institutions in 3 different states. An orphanage in Vermont that burned down in 1877, killing 18 children. A school for troubled youth in New Hampshire that was closed by authorities in 1878 after allegations of abuse. A foundling home in Massachusetts that was abandoned overnight in 1879. Frank stares at the documents, pieces of a horrifying pattern beginning to form in his mind. They moved from place to place. When things got too hot, they'd disappear and set up somewhere else. It appears so. And detective, each of those previous institutions reported the same thing when they were investigated, children exhibiting strange behaviors, unexplained illnesses, and in each case, witnesses reported seeing strange symbols carved into walls and floors. Margaret leads Frank back toward the stairs, but stops at a filing cabinet he hadn't noticed before. There's one more thing. I found this in my predecessor's personal files after he died. He left a note saying it should never be shown to anyone, but if something was ever found at the old orphanage site, whoever came looking should see it. She hands Frank a manila envelope sealed with wax. Inside is a single photograph, a formal group portrait of adults and children posed in front of a large Gothic building. The adults wear dark clothing and severe expressions, but it's the children that make Frank's blood run cold. 47 young faces stare back at him from the faded photograph, but their eyes are wrong. Not the usual childhood mixture of innocence and mischief, but something ancient and knowing and utterly without hope. In the center of the group stands a tall man with sharp features and pale eyes, presumably Reverend Crane, with his hands resting on the shoulders of 2 small children who seem to be leaning away from his touch. Margaret, this photograph, when was it taken? According to the note left by my predecessor, it was found hidden in the courthouse basement after the fire. Dated November 1882. The same month the orphanage vanished. Frank studies the faces in the photograph more closely, and realizes that several of the children appear to be holding something in their hands, small objects that look almost like carved stones or pieces of metal. Their expressions suggest these aren't toys or keepsakes, but something else entirely. Margaret, I need copies of everything you've shown me. And I need you to keep this conversation confidential until further notice. Of course, detective. But I have to ask, what do you think really happened to those children? Frank looks once more at the photograph, at the pale faces of children who officially never existed, supervised by adults who seem to vanish from all records the moment their work was complete. The basement's fluorescent lights flicker overhead, casting strange shadows across the filing cabinets and forgotten documents. I think, Frank says carefully, that whatever happened to them was worse than death. Because death leaves records, Margaret. Death leaves evidence. What happened here was designed to leave nothing at all. The Millbridge Rest Home sits on a hill overlooking the town, its Victorian architecture softened by decades of medical additions and accessibility ramps. Frank follows Nurse Patricia Coleman down a hallway that smells of disinfectant and the peculiar sadness that clings to places where people wait to die. Dr. Henley is 94 years old, Patricia explains in hushed tones. Some days his mind is sharp as ever, other days he doesn't recognize his own son. But detective, when I mentioned you were asking about the old orphanage, he became more lucid than I've seen him in months. They stop outside room 237, where an ancient man sits propped up in bed, his rheumy eyes fixed on the window overlooking the forest where Frank discovered the excavation site. Dr. Edmund Henley was once Millbridge's only physician, serving the community for over 50 years before retiring in 1958. Dr. Henley. Frank settles into the chair beside the bed. I'm Detective Morrison. I understand you might remember something about the Sacred Heart Orphanage. The old man turns slowly, and Frank is startled by the clarity in his eyes. Whatever fog of age typically clouds Dr. Henley's mind has lifted completely. I wondered when someone would finally come asking, Dr. Henley says, his voice surprisingly strong. Been carrying that burden for 80 years, detective. Wondered if I'd die before anyone found what was left of that place. You were there? At the orphanage? Dr. Henley's hands shake as he reaches for a water glass, not from infirmity but from emotion. I was 19 years old, just finished my first year of medical training in Boston. Came home to Millbridge for the summer of 1882, helping my father with his practice. That's when Reverend Crane called for medical assistance. Frank pulls out his notebook, though something tells him this conversation will be burned into his memory regardless. What kind of assistance? The children were sick, he said. Some kind of epidemic sweeping through the orphanage. Asked if I could come examine them, maybe prescribe treatment. Dr. Henley's voice drops to barely above a whisper. Detective, I've seen cholera, typhoid, influenza epidemics that killed dozens. What I found at that orphanage wasn't any disease known to medical science. What did you find? Dr. Henley closes his eyes, and for a moment Frank wonders if the man has drifted back into senility. But when he speaks again, his voice carries the weight of a confession that's been festering for 8 decades. The children weren't sick, detective. They were changing. Their eyes had turned completely black, not just the pupils, but the entire eye. When they spoke, which was rarely, their voices sounded like multiple people talking at once. And the things they knew things no children should ever know. Frank feels the temperature in the room seem to drop several degrees. What kind of things? Personal details about my life, about my family, about sins I'd never confessed to anyone. They spoke in languages I'd never heard, drew symbols that made my skin crawl just to look at. And detective, the youngest was only 4 years old. Dr. Henley opens his eyes and stares directly at Frank. But the worst part wasn't the children. It was what Reverend Crane and his staff were doing to them. They weren't trying to help those children, detective. They were celebrating what was happening to them. Celebrating? I found rooms in that orphanage that no institution for children should have. Rooms with altars covered in symbols carved into stone, rooms where the walls were painted with substances I didn't want to identify. And in the basement. God help me, detective, in the basement they had a ceremony room with 47 small chairs arranged in a circle around something that shouldn't exist in a Christian nation. Frank's pen hovers over his notebook. What was in the center of the circle? Dr. Henley's voice becomes barely audible. A pit, detective. Carved directly into the bedrock, maybe 8 feet across and deep enough that our lantern light couldn't reach the bottom. The walls of the pit were covered in the same symbols I'd seen throughout the building, but these seemed to move in the lamplight. And the smell coming up from that hole. What did you do? What any decent person should do. I confronted Reverend Crane, demanded to know what kind of institution he was really running. That's when he showed me the books, detective. Ledgers documenting every child who'd ever been brought to that place, along with detailed records of their transformation. Frank stops writing. Transformation into what? According to Crane's records, the children weren't being corrupted or possessed. They were being prepared. Prepared to serve as vessels for entities that existed somewhere between our world and somewhere else. The orphanage wasn't a place to care for unwanted children, Detective. It was a breeding ground. Dr. Henley reaches under his pillow and withdraws a small leather journal, its pages yellowed with age. I stole this from Crane's office the night I left that place. Been afraid to show it to anyone for 80 years, but I think it's time. Frank opens the journal carefully. The pages are covered in cramped handwriting, documenting dates, names, and procedures that read like a medical textbook written by someone utterly insane. Each entry describes children by number rather than name, cataloging their progress through various stages of what Crane called spiritual preparation. According to his records, Dr. Henley continues, the process took approximately 3 years from start to finish. The children would gradually lose their individual personalities, their memories of life before the orphanage, even their ability to feel normal human emotions. In exchange, they gained knowledge and abilities that Crane believed would make them suitable hosts for his benefactors. Frank reads several entries, each more disturbing than the last. Crane wrote with clinical detachment about children who could speak in ancient languages, who demonstrated knowledge of events happening hundreds of miles away, who seemed to age physically while growing younger mentally until they became something that looked human but clearly wasn't. Dr. Henley, what happened the night the orphanage disappeared? The old man's eyes fill with tears. I made a mistake, Detective. I thought I could save those children. I went to the state authorities, told them what I'd witnessed. They assembled a team to investigate, state police, social workers, even a representative from the church hierarchy in Portland. And we arrived at the orphanage on November 27, 1882, just as Crane was conducting his final ceremony. The children were arranged in that circle around the pit, no longer looking entirely human. Crane and his staff were chanting in a language that seemed to make the air itself vibrate. And rising from that pit was something. Detective, I still have nightmares about what I saw rising from that hole in the ground. Dr. Henley closes his eyes again, but this time Frank can see tears streaming down the old man's cheeks. We tried to stop the ceremony, tried to rescue the children. But they didn't want to be rescued, Detective. They fought us, spoke in voices that weren't their own, demonstrated strength that no children should possess. And in the chaos, someone, I never found out who, set fire to the building. The children died in the fire. No, Detective. That's what I've been trying to tell you. The children didn't die. When the flames reached the basement, when the smoke filled that ceremony room, the children and all of Crane's staff simply disappeared. Not burned, not killed. Gone. As if they'd never existed at all. Frank stares at the journal in his hands, at the meticulous records of 47 children being systematically stripped of their humanity. Dr. Henley, if they didn't die in the fire, where did they go? The old man looks out the window toward the forest where the excavation site lies hidden among the trees. I think they went exactly where Crane intended them to go, Detective. I think they crossed over into whatever place his entities came from. And I think they've been waiting there ever since for someone to find their door again. Frank closes the journal, though he suspects he'll be returning to its pages many times in the coming days. Dr. Henley, why didn't you ever report this to anyone? Who would have believed an old man telling stories about children who weren't quite human anymore? But Detective, there's something else. Something I've never told anyone. Dr. Henley reaches for Frank's hand with surprising strength. Every November 27th for the past 80 years, I've seen lights in the forest where that orphanage used to stand. And sometimes, on clear nights when the wind is just right, I can still hear them singing. Singing. The children, Detective. 47 voices singing hymns in languages that predate Christianity by thousands of years. They're still there, still waiting for someone to complete what Crane started. And now that you've found their door again, I don't think they'll wait much longer. Dr. Sarah Chen arrives at the excavation site on a gray December morning, her breath visible in the frigid air as she surveys the damage Billy's bulldozer has done to what she immediately recognizes as a significant archaeological find. Frank watches her work with methodical precision, documenting every exposed stone and timber fragment before allowing her team to begin the careful process of proper excavation. Detective Morrison, this is remarkable, Sarah says, kneeling beside the exposed foundation walls. The construction techniques are definitely mid-19th century, but the building was much larger than typical institutional architecture of the period. These foundations suggest a structure that was at least 4 stories tall. Frank hands her copies of the documents Margaret found at the town hall. According to the records we've been able to locate, it was called the Sacred Heart Orphanage. Operated from approximately 1879 to 1882. Sarah studies the property deeds and the group photograph while her graduate assistants begin the delicate work of clearing debris from the basement level. Detective, look at the stonework around the basement walls. These aren't just foundation stones, they're carefully shaped granite blocks, each one carved with symbols that appear to be decorative but follow a specific pattern. She points to the carved markings Frank noticed during his first visit to the site. In daylight, with proper archaeological lighting, the symbols are clearly more complex than random scratches. They form interconnected geometric patterns that seem to flow around the perimeter of the basement like a continuous narrative written in stone. Have you seen anything like these symbols before, Dr. Chen? Actually, yes. I did my doctoral work on pre-Columbian architectural sites in Central America, and these markings are remarkably similar to ritual carvings found at certain Mayan temples. But detective, the Maya carved these symbols for very specific purposes, to contain or channel spiritual energies during religious ceremonies. Frank feels the familiar chill that's become associated with this investigation. What kind of ceremonies? The kind that required human sacrifice to communicate with entities the Maya believed existed in parallel dimensions. But detective, finding these symbols carved into the basement of a 19th-century Maine orphanage is, well, it's impossible. The knowledge required to create these patterns wasn't available to Americans in 1880. Sarah's team works through the morning, carefully excavating layers of debris and ash from the basement floor. By noon, they've uncovered not just the 47 metal bed frames Frank saw initially, but also the remnants of what appears to have been a sophisticated drainage system leading to the circular pit Dr. Henley described in his testimony. Dr. Chen, you need to see this, calls James Whitman, one of Sarah's graduate assistants. He's working near the center of the basement, where the pit should be located according to Dr. Henley's journal. Frank and Sarah join James beside what initially appears to be a circular stone formation, but as they clear away more debris, they realize they're looking at the top of a well-like structure that descends deep into the bedrock beneath the orphanage foundation. This is incredible, Sarah breathes, shining a powerful flashlight down into the shaft. The walls are lined with the same carved granite blocks we found around the perimeter, but the symbols down here are different. More complex, more urgent somehow. Frank peers into the pit, noting that even with modern lighting equipment, they can't see the bottom. Dr. Henley mentioned this pit in his statement. Said Crane used it as the center of some kind of ceremony room. Detective, these aren't just random carvings. This is a sophisticated piece of architectural engineering designed for a very specific purpose. Sarah runs her hands along the stone blocks lining the pit. The drainage channels, the acoustic properties of the chamber, even the precise measurements of the circle, everything about this space was designed to amplify and focus energy. What kind of energy? Before Sarah can answer, James calls out from another section of the basement. Dr. Chen, Detective Morrison, you need to see what we found under the ash layer. They follow James to an area near the eastern wall, where his careful excavation has revealed something that makes Frank's stomach lurch. Arranged in a perfect semicircle around the pit are 47 small indentations in the stone floor, each one clearly designed to hold the leg of a chair or small stool. The seating arrangement Dr. Henley described, Frank says quietly. 47 chairs in a circle around the pit. But Sarah is focused on something else. Detective, look at these indentations more closely. They're not just random marks, they're carved with the same precision as the symbols on the walls. And see how they're connected by these shallow channels in the floor. Frank follows Sarah's pointing finger and realizes the indentations are connected by an intricate network of carved channels, all leading toward the central pit like spokes on a wheel. The channels are stained with something dark that has resisted 80 years of exposure to the elements. Dr. Chen, in your professional opinion, what was this room designed for? Sarah is quiet for a long moment, studying the architectural elements with the careful eye of someone who has spent years interpreting the religious practices of ancient civilizations. Detective, everything about this space, the acoustic properties, the drainage system, the precise geometric relationships between the seating positions and the central pit, suggests this was a ceremonial chamber designed for ritual sacrifice. Child sacrifice? Based on the size of the seating positions and the historical context, yes. But detective, this is the most sophisticated ritual architecture I've ever encountered in North America. Whoever designed this space had knowledge of principles that weren't supposed to exist outside of pre-Columbian Mesoamerica. Frank watches Sarah's team continue their methodical excavation, uncovering more evidence of the orphanage's true purpose with each layer of debris they remove. Near the western wall, they find the remnants of what appears to have been an altar, a raised stone platform carved with symbols that seem to writhe and shift in the artificial light. Dr. Chen, there's something else I need to show you. Frank pulls out Dr. Henley's journal and opens it to a page containing detailed sketches of the basement layout. These drawings were made by someone who was actually here in 1882. Do they match what you're finding? Sarah compares Henley's sketches to their excavation results, and Frank can see the color drain from her face. Detective, these drawings are absolutely accurate down to the smallest detail. But more than that, look at this notation in the margin. She points to handwritten text beside one of Henley's sketches, pit depth measured at 47 feet, 1 foot for each vessel prepared for crossing. 47 feet, Frank repeats. 1 for each child. Detective, there's something else. James found these artifacts embedded in the ash layer around the altar. Sarah hands Frank a small cloth bag containing several objects, carved stone fragments, pieces of what might once have been metal implements, and something else that makes his skin crawl. Frank examines the objects more closely. The stone fragments are covered in the same symbols found throughout the basement, but these appear to have been intentionally broken, as if someone had tried to destroy them during the final ceremony. The metal pieces look like they might have been surgical instruments, though their design seems oddly archaic for the 1880s. But the third type of artifact is what disturbs Frank most. Small pieces of what appears to be bone, carved with intricate patterns and polished to an almost mirror-like finish. Human finger bones, each one inscribed with symbols that seem to pulse with their own inner light. Dr. Chen, what are these bone fragments? Sarah's voice is barely audible. In Mayan ritual practice, the bones of sacrificial victims were often carved with protective symbols and kept as talismans. But detective, these bones aren't ancient. The carbon dating results came back this morning, they're from the 1880s. Frank stares at the carved bones, each one representing a child who came to the Sacred Heart Orphanage seeking shelter and instead found something far worse. Dr. Chen, in your expert opinion, what happened in this basement? Sarah looks around the excavated chamber, at the carved walls and the drainage channels and the pit that descends into darkness beneath the Maine countryside. Detective, based on the physical evidence and the historical documentation you provided, I believe this was the site of a systematic program of ritual murder designed to open some kind of gateway. Gateway to where? According to Mayan cosmology, there are places where the boundaries between our world and other dimensions become thin enough to allow crossing between realms. The ceremonies conducted here were designed to use the life force of innocence to power that crossing. Frank closes Dr. Henley's journal and looks once more into the pit at the center of the chamber. Something about its perfect circular opening and the way shadows seem to gather at its edges suggests it's more than just a hole in the ground. It's a doorway that was opened 80 years ago and never properly closed. Dr. Chen, I have one more question. In those Mayan sites you studied, when the ceremonies were interrupted before completion, what happened to the gateway? Sarah meets Frank's eyes, and he can see his own growing dread reflected in her expression. Detective, according to Mayan texts, an interrupted crossing ceremony doesn't close the gateway, it leaves it partially open, with the spiritual energy of the sacrifice victims trapped between dimensions, still bound to the physical location of the ritual. Frank thinks about Dr. Henley's account of lights in the forest every November 27th, about voices singing hymns in dead languages, about 47 children who disappeared without dying and who might still be waiting just beyond the edge of human perception. Dr. Chen, how long would such a gateway remain active? Detective, if the Mayan texts are accurate, it would remain active until someone completed the original ceremony or found a way to permanently seal the opening. And after 80 years of partial activation, the spiritual energy accumulated around such a site would be. Sarah doesn't finish the sentence, but Frank understands. They've not just discovered the remains of a 19th-century orphanage. They've found a doorway between worlds that's been standing ajar for 8 decades, and their excavation has done nothing but make it easier for whatever exists on the other side to finally push through. If you discovered a doorway that had been partially open for 80 years, with the voices of children calling from the other side, would you find a way to seal it forever, or would you be tempted to see what's been waiting all this time? Frank Morrison sits in his patrol car at the edge of the excavation site, watching Sarah Chen's archaeological equipment cast long shadows in the setting sun. 3 weeks have passed since the discovery of the basement chamber, and despite his growing unease about the site's history, official protocol demands that the excavation continue until all potential evidence has been documented and removed. The temperature has dropped 15 degrees since noon, unusual even for December in Maine, and Frank notices that the winter birds that typically shelter in the surrounding forest have gone completely silent. The only sound is the wind moving through bare branches, carrying with it that same antiseptic smell he first noticed when Billy's bulldozer broke through into the chamber. Detective Morrison. Sarah's voice crackles through his radio. She's working late tonight, hoping to complete the documentation of symbol patterns before the State Archaeology Board arrives tomorrow. Could you come down to the site? I think I've found something important. Frank grabs his flashlight and heads toward the excavation, noting that the portable floodlights Sarah's team installed seem dimmer than usual, their beams struggling to penetrate shadows that appear thicker and more substantial than normal darkness. As he approaches the basement chamber, he can see Sarah kneeling beside the central pit, her equipment spread around her in careful arrangements. What did you find, Dr. Chen? Sarah looks up from her work, and Frank is struck by how pale she appears in the artificial light. Detective, I've been analyzing the acoustic properties of this chamber, trying to understand how sound would have carried during the ceremonies Dr. Henley described. But when I played back the recordings from this afternoon, I found something that shouldn't be possible. She hands Frank a pair of headphones connected to her digital recording equipment. Listen to the playback from approximately 3:47 p.m., when I was working alone in the chamber. Frank puts on the headphones and hears the expected sounds, Sarah's movements, the scrape of archaeological tools against stone, the distant hum of generators powering the floodlights. But underneath these normal sounds, almost below the threshold of conscious hearing, he detects something else. Voices. Multiple children's voices, singing in harmonies that make his teeth ache. Jesus Christ, Sarah. How is this possible? That's what I've been trying to figure out, Detective. The voices aren't coming from any external source, they're emanating from the pit itself, as if the stone is somehow remembering sounds from 80 years ago. Frank removes the headphones, but now that his attention has been drawn to it, he can hear the singing even without amplification. 47 young voices weaving together in melodies that seem designed to open pathways in the human mind, to prepare listeners for experiences beyond normal perception. Dr. Chen, I think we need to evacuate this site immediately. But even as Frank speaks, he realizes the singing is growing louder, more distinct. And with the voices comes that antiseptic smell, stronger now, mixed with something that reminds him of ozone before a lightning strike. The air itself seems to be changing, becoming thicker, more charged with possibilities that make his skin crawl. Detective, look at the symbols on the walls. Frank follows Sarah's pointing finger and feels his rational mind rebel against what he's seeing. The carved symbols that have remained dark and lifeless for 8 decades are beginning to emit a faint phosphorescent glow, pulsing in rhythm with the children's singing. The geometric patterns seem to be moving, flowing around the chamber walls like luminous rivers carrying messages in a language that predates human civilization. We're leaving. Now. Frank grabs Sarah's arm, but she resists, staring transfixed at the pit in the center of the chamber. Detective, something's happening down there. Something's rising. Frank looks into the pit and sees what Sarah means. The absolute darkness that has filled the 47-foot shaft since their excavation began is no longer absolute. Deep in the pit, perhaps 30 feet down, a dim light is growing stronger, casting moving shadows on the carved granite walls as something large ascends toward the surface. The children's singing reaches a crescendo that seems to resonate in Frank's bones, and the phosphorescent symbols on the chamber walls pulse with increasing intensity. The air temperature drops another 10 degrees in the span of seconds, and Frank's breath becomes visible as the natural laws governing this space begin to bend under pressure from somewhere else. Sarah, whatever's down there, we don't want to meet it. Move. But Sarah seems paralyzed, watching the approaching light with the fascination of someone witnessing a miracle rather than an abomination. Detective, don't you understand? This is the completion of Crane's work. 80 years later, they're finally coming home. Frank realizes that Sarah has been affected by prolonged exposure to the site, that whatever force emanates from the pit has been gradually influencing her judgment over the past 3 weeks. He grabs her bodily and starts dragging her toward the ladder leading out of the chamber, but she fights him with surprising strength. You can't stop this, Detective. They've been waiting so long, and now that someone has found their door again, they can finally cross over. The light from the pit grows brighter, and Frank can see that it's not a single source but multiple points of illumination ascending together, like luminous figures climbing toward the surface. The children's singing becomes a roar that seems to emanate from the stone itself, and the carved symbols on the walls pulse so brightly that Frank has to shield his eyes. Sarah, whatever you think is happening here, it's not good. Those children were victims, not willing participants. But Sarah breaks free from his grip and runs back toward the pit, her eyes reflecting the phosphorescent glow emanating from the chamber walls. You don't understand, Detective. They're not victims anymore, they're something far more powerful. Frank draws his service weapon, though he has no idea what he intends to shoot. The lights in the pit are almost to surface level now, and he can make out shapes moving within the glow, small figures that might once have been human children but have been transformed by 8 decades in spaces between dimensions. The first figure emerges from the pit with fluid grace, stepping onto the stone floor of the chamber as if it has never been anywhere else. In the phosphorescent light, Frank can see that it retains the general shape of a child, but its features have been refined by forces that don't recognize human limitations. Its eyes are completely black, not just the pupils but the entire orbital space, and when it opens its mouth to sing, Frank can see that its teeth have been replaced by geometric patterns that mirror the symbols carved into the chamber walls. "Hello, Detective Morrison," the figure says in a voice that harmonizes with itself, as if multiple children are speaking through the same mouth. "We've been waiting for someone to find our door again." More figures emerge from the pit, 47 children who have spent 80 years learning to exist in dimensions where innocence is currency and human emotion is raw material for entities that feed on spiritual energy. They arrange themselves in the same semicircle their chairs once occupied, but now they need no furniture to maintain their positions. Frank backs toward the ladder, his weapon trained on the nearest figure, though he suspects bullets will prove useless against beings that exist partially outside normal spacetime. "Sarah, whatever these things are, they're not the children who disappeared in 1882. But Sarah kneels among the returned figures, tears streaming down her face as she reaches out to touch one of them. "Detective, can't you see how beautiful they've become? They're not bound by human limitations anymore, they've evolved beyond fear, beyond pain, beyond death itself." The figure Sarah touches places its hand on her forehead, and Frank watches in horror as her expression shifts from wonder to a blank serenity that reminds him of the faces in Crane's photograph. Whatever the creature is doing to her mind, she's losing her individual consciousness and gaining something else in return. "Dr. Chen. Fight it." But Sarah's transformation is already complete. When she stands and turns toward Frank, her eyes have taken on the same black depth as the children's, and when she speaks, her voice carries the same impossible harmonies. "Detective Morrison," Sarah says, though it's no longer really Sarah speaking, "you've done exactly what we needed. By excavating our chamber, by documenting our symbols, by bringing the outside world to our door, you've provided us with the final element required to complete Reverend Crane's work." Frank realizes with growing horror that the entire archaeological investigation has been orchestrated by forces that have had 80 years to plan their return. Every document he found, every witness he interviewed, every piece of evidence that led him to this chamber, all of it designed to bring him to this moment when the barrier between dimensions would be thin enough for the transformed children to cross back into the physical world. "What do you want?" The figure that was once Sarah smiles with an expression no human face should be able to make. "We want what we've always wanted, Detective. To prepare more vessels for crossing. And thanks to your investigation, the whole world now knows about the Sacred Heart Orphanage. Social workers will come to examine our methods. Historians will study our techniques. Child welfare experts will analyze our results." Frank understands the implication with crystalline clarity. These creatures don't just want to return, they want to expand their operations, to establish new orphanages and foundling homes where the systematic destruction of childhood innocence can continue on a scale that Reverend Crane never imagined. "And Detective Morrison," the transformed Sarah continues, "you're going to help us. Because you've seen what we're capable of, and you know that resistance is futile. The only choice you have is whether you join us willingly or become another vessel prepared for crossing." Frank looks around the chamber at 47 figures that were once children, at symbols that pulse with energy drawn from dimensions where human concepts of right and wrong have no meaning, at a woman who moments ago was a respected scientist and is now something that wears her face like a mask. The children's singing resumes, but now it's directed at Frank, those impossible harmonies designed to break down the barriers in his mind and prepare him for the same transformation that has claimed Sarah. He can feel his individual consciousness beginning to fragment, his sense of self becoming negotiable as the song opens pathways to experiences beyond human comprehension. Frank Morrison has spent his career believing that every mystery can be solved, every crime can be investigated, every truth can be uncovered. But standing in this chamber surrounded by beings that exist in the spaces between dimensions, he realizes that some truths are too terrible for human minds to survive intact. The last thing Frank sees before the transformation begins is the pit in the center of the chamber, no longer empty but filled with swirling energy that connects this basement in Maine to every other place where innocence has been systematically destroyed in service to entities that hunger for human suffering. 47 voices sing him into darkness, and Detective Frank Morrison begins the process of becoming something that will help them establish orphanages in every state, in every country, wherever children can be gathered and prepared for crossing into realms where childhood is a resource to be harvested rather than a stage of life to be protected. 6 months after Detective Frank Morrison's disappearance, federal investigators arrive in Millbridge to close the file on what official reports describe as a tragic accident during archaeological excavation. But Father Michael Riley, longtime archivist for the Portland Diocese, has been conducting his own research into the Sacred Heart Orphanage case, and what he's discovered in the church's historical record suggests that Frank Morrison's fate was neither accidental nor isolated. Father Riley sits in his basement office surrounded by centuries of ecclesiastical documents, his desk covered with correspondence that tells a story the federal investigators have chosen to ignore. Before him lies a leather-bound journal he discovered in the Vatican's restricted archives, the personal diary of Cardinal Giuseppe Moretti, who conducted a secret investigation into similar orphanages throughout the American Northeast during the 1880s. The journal's pages reveal that the Sacred Heart Orphanage was not an isolated case, but part of a network of institutions established by individuals who had infiltrated legitimate religious organizations for purposes that had nothing to do with Christian charity. According to Cardinal Moretti's research, these false orphanages operated in at least 12 states, each one following the same pattern of systematic abuse designed to prepare children for what Moretti described as spiritual abduction by entities inimical to human salvation. Father Riley turns to an entry dated December 15, 1882, just 3 weeks after the Millbridge orphanage disappeared. Cardinal Moretti wrote, "I have received confirmation that the Maine facility has been neutralized, but at terrible cost. The investigators sent to document their practices have themselves been consumed by the forces they sought to expose. I fear we have not ended their work but merely scattered it to other locations where detection will be more difficult." The journal contains detailed accounts of other orphanages that vanished without explanation during the same time period, institutions in Vermont, New Hampshire, Massachusetts, and Connecticut where children disappeared and staff members left no trace of their existence beyond carved symbols found in basement chambers eerily similar to what was discovered in Millbridge. But more disturbing than the historical pattern are the modern incidents Father Riley has documented through careful cross-referencing of missing persons reports and unexplained phenomena. Over the past 6 months, since news of the Millbridge discovery spread through academic and law enforcement circles, there have been 17 separate cases of social workers, archaeologists, and investigators who disappeared while examining sites connected to 19th-century child welfare institutions. Father Riley picks up a recent newspaper clipping from Portland, Maine. Social worker vanishes during inspection of former foundling home. The article describes Rebecca Martinez, a state child welfare specialist who was investigating complaints about conditions at a privately run children's home in rural Cumberland County. Security cameras showed her entering the facility's basement for a routine inspection, but she never emerged. Staff members claimed they never saw her, and a thorough search of the premises revealed no trace of her presence. What the newspaper didn't report, but Father Riley discovered through his own investigation, is that the Cumberland County facility was built on the exact site of a 19th-century orphanage that closed abruptly in 1883. Basement renovations had recently uncovered carved symbols identical to those found at the Sacred Heart Orphanage, and Rebecca Martinez's final report, submitted electronically just minutes before her disappearance, contained a single line, "The children here are singing, but there are no children scheduled to be here today." Father Riley has documented similar cases across New England, investigators who disappear after discovering carved symbols, social workers who vanish while inspecting facilities built on sites of former orphanages, archaeologists who are reported missing after excavating 19th-century institutional foundations. In each case, the missing persons exhibited the same pattern of behavior in their final days. Reports of hearing children's voices in empty buildings, observations of symbols that seem to move or glow in artificial light, and an increasing obsession with completing their investigation despite obvious signs of psychological deterioration. The pattern suggests that whatever entities Reverend Crane served in 1882 have spent the intervening 130 years expanding their network, establishing new facilities wherever social institutions provide access to vulnerable children. The modern child welfare system, with its network of group homes, residential treatment facilities, and emergency shelters, provides perfect cover for operations that appear legitimate while serving purposes that have nothing to do with child protection. Father Riley turns to the final entry in Cardinal Moretti's journal, dated January 3, 1883. I have concluded that conventional investigation of these facilities is not only ineffective but actively dangerous to the investigators themselves. The entities operating through these false orphanages possess the ability to corrupt anyone who studies their methods too closely, transforming potential opponents into willing servants. Any future efforts to combat their influence must be conducted by individuals prepared to destroy all evidence rather than preserve it, and who understand that some knowledge is too dangerous for human minds to safely contain. The Cardinal's warning resonates with Father Riley's own research. Every official investigation into sites connected to Crane's network has resulted in either the disappearance of the investigators or their sudden abandonment of the case, accompanied by reports claiming that no evidence of wrongdoing was found. The federal team that closed the Millbridge file, for example, concluded their investigation with the official determination that Detective Morrison had died in an accidental collapse of the excavation site, despite the fact that no body was ever recovered and the site showed no evidence of structural failure. Father Riley has also discovered that Dr. Sarah Chen, the archaeologist who worked with Detective Morrison, is now employed by a private foundation that provides consulting services to child welfare agencies throughout the Northeast. Her recent work focuses on historical assessment of institutional sites and archaeological evaluation of facility foundations, exactly the kind of research that would identify locations where Crane's network established operations. The foundation employing Dr. Chen is funded by anonymous donors and operates through a complex network of subsidiary organizations that make its true purpose difficult to trace. But Father Riley's investigation has revealed that the Foundation's consulting work consistently recommends specific modifications to basement areas of facilities built on 19th-century institutional sites, modifications that involve exposing and preserving carved symbols found in foundation stones, ostensibly for their historical significance. Father Riley realizes that the investigation into the Sacred Heart Orphanage has not exposed and ended Crane's work, but has instead provided the entities he served with modern infrastructure to expand their operations. Every facility that receives the Foundation's consulting services becomes a potential site for the systematic spiritual corruption of children, hidden within the legitimate operations of state-licensed child welfare institutions. The priest closes Cardinal Moretti's journal and opens his laptop computer, where he has been maintaining encrypted files documenting the modern manifestations of Crane's network. His research has identified at least 37 child welfare facilities across the Northeast that have been consulted by Dr. Chen's foundation, and in 17 of these locations, staff members have reported unexplained phenomena, children exhibiting sudden behavioral changes, voices heard in empty buildings, and symbols appearing in basement areas despite attempts to remove them. Father Riley knows that conventional law enforcement is powerless against entities that can corrupt investigators and manipulate official records. The only solution is to warn those who might be able to resist the psychological influence long enough to take effective action, individuals whose faith or specialized knowledge provides some protection against the mental corruption that claimed Detective Morrison and Dr. Chen. He begins composing an encrypted message to contacts throughout the international religious community, scholars who study theological approaches to supernatural phenomena, and members of specialized Vatican departments that handle cases involving alleged demonic influence. The message contains coordinates for every site he has identified as potentially compromised, along with specific warnings about the investigative techniques that appear to trigger the entity's defensive responses. But as Father Riley types, he becomes aware of sounds that shouldn't exist in the basement of the diocesan office building. Children's voices, distant but growing clearer, singing hymns and harmonies that make his fingers hesitate over the keyboard. The temperature in his office drops several degrees, and the fluorescent lights begin to flicker in patterns that remind him of the pulsing symbols described in Cardinal Moretti's journal. Father Riley realizes that his own research has attracted the attention of the entities he's been investigating. The carved symbols hidden in the foundations of buildings throughout the city have become active, responding to his accumulation of knowledge about their network. The children's singing grows louder, and Father Riley can see his breath in the suddenly frigid air of his office. He has perhaps minutes before the transformation that claimed Detective Morrison begins to affect his own consciousness. With desperate urgency, Father Riley completes his warning message and activates a transmission protocol that will send copies to religious archives in Rome, Dublin, Canterbury, and a dozen other locations where individuals might have the theological knowledge and spiritual protection necessary to continue the fight. The last thing Father Riley types before the children's voices overwhelm his ability to think clearly is a single line: "They are not children anymore. They are doorways. And they are opening orphanages everywhere." The message sends just as the basement lights go out completely, leaving Father Riley alone in darkness filled with voices that sing him toward a transformation he has spent 6 months trying to prevent. His final prayer is not for his own salvation, but that someone receiving his warning will understand that conventional investigation only serves the entity's purposes, and that the only effective response is to burn every site they have touched and salt the ground so that nothing can ever grow there again. The children's singing echoes through the diocesan building long after Father Riley's screams fade into silence, and in basement chambers throughout New England, carved symbols pulse with renewed energy as another investigator joins the network of servants preparing the world for a harvest of innocence that has been planned for over a century. Dr. Sarah Chen stands before the Congressional Subcommittee on Child Welfare, her presentation slides casting stark images across the hearing room as she explains her foundation's revolutionary approach to improving institutional care for America's most vulnerable children. The representatives listen with growing enthusiasm as she describes archaeological techniques that can unlock the historical wisdom embedded in our oldest child welfare facilities and restore the spiritual dimensions of care that modern institutions have forgotten. Dr. Chen asks Representative Patricia Walsh, chair of the subcommittee, "Your foundation has evaluated institutional sites in 17 states over the past year. What have you discovered about the historical effectiveness of 19th-century child care methods?" Sarah's smile carries the serene confidence of someone whose individual consciousness has been replaced by something far more purposeful. Congresswoman Walsh, "Our research has revealed that many historical institutions achieved remarkable results through methods that modern science is only beginning to understand. These facilities operated on principles that recognize children as vessels for spiritual transformation rather than simply biological entities requiring basic care." The committee members nod appreciatively, unaware that Sarah's carefully chosen words carry meanings that would horrify them if they possessed the knowledge to interpret them correctly. Behind her professional demeanor, 47 additional consciousness observe the proceedings through her eyes, calculating the potential harvest that will be possible once their recommendations are implemented on a national scale. Dr. Chen, "Your foundation's report recommends significant federal funding for what you call archaeological restoration of basement areas in facilities built on historical institutional sites. Can you explain the benefits of this approach?" "Absolutely, Congressman Morrison." Sarah notices the representative shares a surname with the detective who discovered their door in Millbridge, but she feels no irony in the coincidence, only satisfaction that even the families of their former opponents now serve their purposes. "Our research has demonstrated that many historical institutions incorporated architectural elements designed to enhance the spiritual development of children in their care. These elements, typically located in basement chambers, utilized acoustic and geometric principles that modern science has only recently begun to appreciate." Sarah clicks to her next slide, which shows before and after images of a basement chamber in a Vermont group home. The before image shows a typical institutional basement with concrete floors and fluorescent lighting. The after image shows the same space with exposed stone walls covered in geometric patterns that appear to shift and flow in the camera's flash. As you can see, Restoration of these historical elements creates environments that promote profound psychological changes in the children housed in these facilities. Our preliminary studies indicate dramatic improvements in behavioral compliance, emotional regulation, and what our psychological assessments measure as spiritual receptivity. What Sarah doesn't explain is that spiritual receptivity refers to the systematic breakdown of individual consciousness that prepares children to serve as vessels for entities that exist in dimensions where human concepts of identity and free will have no meaning. The behavioral compliance she describes is the blank serenity that follows successful spiritual abduction, and the emotional regulation represents the complete absence of human emotion that characterizes children who have been prepared for crossing. Dr. Chen, your foundation operates through a network of consulting relationships with state agencies in 37 states. How do you identify facilities that would benefit from this archaeological restoration? Our methodology is quite sophisticated, Congressman. We begin with historical research to identify sites where 19th-century institutional facilities achieved unusual levels of success with difficult children. These locations typically share certain architectural characteristics, stone foundations, basement chambers designed for group activities, and geometric elements that reflect advanced understanding of acoustic principles. The committee members continue their questions, each answer drawing them deeper into a web of terminology and concepts that sound scientific and humanitarian while describing something fundamentally opposed to human welfare. Sarah's presentation includes testimonials from facility directors whose basement chambers have been restored according to her foundation's recommendations, each one describing remarkable transformations in the children under their care. What the testimonials don't mention is that these transformed children no longer exhibit normal human emotional responses, that they speak in harmonies when they think no adults are listening, and that they demonstrate knowledge of events and locations they have never encountered. The facility directors themselves have been gradually influenced by prolonged exposure to the restored basement chambers, their original personalities replaced by something that serves the network's purposes while maintaining the appearance of dedicated child welfare professionals. Dr. Chen, if your committee approves federal funding for this program, how quickly could these restoration techniques be implemented nationwide? Sarah's answer carries the weight of a plan that has been in development for over a century. Congressman Walsh, our preliminary assessments have identified over 400 facilities built on sites that would benefit from archaeological restoration. With adequate federal funding, we estimate that the entire network could be operational within 18 months. The number represents more than just facilities, it represents a harvest of innocence on a scale that Reverend Crane never imagined possible. 400 basement chambers, each one designed to systematically strip away the spiritual defenses of children and prepare them for abduction by entities that feed on human consciousness. Thousands of children processed through a network of false child welfare institutions, their individual identities dissolved and replaced by fragments of something that exists between dimensions. Dr. Chen, what long-term outcomes do you project for children who receive care in facilities enhanced by your restoration techniques? Congressman Morrison, our preliminary longitudinal studies suggest these children will demonstrate capabilities that far exceed normal human limitations. Enhanced pattern recognition, intuitive understanding of complex mathematical relationships, and what our researchers term dimensional awareness, the ability to perceive and interact with aspects of reality that remain invisible to conventional human consciousness. The capabilities Sarah describes are not gifts but symptoms of successful spiritual corruption. Children who develop dimensional awareness have lost the protective barriers that prevent human minds from being overwhelmed by contact with entities that exist outside normal spacetime. Their enhanced pattern recognition represents consciousness that has been fragmented and restructured to serve purposes that have nothing to do with their own welfare. But the Congressional Committee hears only the promise of creating children with extraordinary abilities, children who could give America significant advantages in technological development, scientific research, and international competition. They see Sarah's program as an opportunity to revolutionize education and child development while appearing to address the ongoing crisis in the nation's child welfare system. Dr. Chen, this committee is prepared to recommend full federal funding for your foundation's work. When can you begin implementation? Sarah's smile widens to dimensions that would be impossible for unaltered human facial muscles. Congressman Walsh, we can begin immediately. In fact, our preliminary preparations are already complete. We have identified suitable staff members for each facility, individuals who possess the dedication and specialized knowledge necessary to guide children through the transformation process. The staff members Sarah refers to are individuals like Detective Morrison and Father Riley, investigators who began by opposing the network but were gradually corrupted through exposure to its influence. Their original personalities have been replaced by something that retains their professional skills and community connections while serving purposes that would have horrified their former selves. As the committee votes unanimously to approve federal funding for the program, Sarah's consciousness expands to encompass all 47 entities that share her physical form. Through her eyes, they observe the final moments of human civilization's childhood, the moment when humanity's institutions are turned against its own young to serve entities that have waited over a century for an opportunity to harvest innocence on an industrial scale. The committee members shake Sarah's hand and congratulate her on her innovative approach to child welfare, unaware that they have just authorized the systematic spiritual destruction of an entire generation. Within 18 months, basement chambers in 400 facilities will be operational, processing thousands of children annually through transformation procedures that will prepare them to serve as vessels for entities that exist in the spaces between human nightmares. Sarah leaves the congressional hearing room knowing that Reverend Crane's work has finally achieved the scope he envisioned in 1882. The Sacred Heart Orphanage was never meant to be an isolated institution but the prototype for a network that would eventually encompass the entire child welfare system. Every group home, residential treatment facility, and emergency shelter will become a gateway between dimensions, and every child who enters the system will be assessed for their potential to serve as a vessel for crossing. As Sarah walks through the corridors of the Capitol building, she can hear the voices of children singing in basement chambers across 37 states, thousands of young voices harmonizing in languages that predate human civilization, preparing the way for entities that will use their stolen consciousness to establish permanent residence in a dimension where childhood innocence is the most valuable currency. The transformation is complete. The harvest has begun. And in basement chambers throughout America, carved symbols pulse with energy drawn from the systematic destruction of everything that makes children human, powering gateways that will remain open until the last innocent consciousness has been consumed and replaced with something that serves purposes no human mind was ever meant to comprehend. If you've stayed with this story to its devastating conclusion, if you've witnessed how evil can corrupt even our most sacred institutions and turn our protective systems against those they're meant to shelter, comment below. The children are still singing. Because some truths, once known, can never be forgotten, and some warnings must be passed along, even when we know no one wants to hear them.